One of the enduring legacies of the history of African Americans held in slavery in this country is the musical genre that emerged as a result of that experience, commonly known as the Negro spiritual. The spirituals combine the rich heritage and culture of the African people with their deeply held hope of freedom against the backdrop of pain and suffering. Small wonder Dr. King referred to Negro spirituals as freedom songs. Dr. James Norris from Howard University, he said that singing was everything to the enslaved Africans. It was how they maintained their sanity and remained hopeful. Joan Walsh Angum, she in her book of poetry called A Cup of Sun, she said, "A bird doesn't sing because it has an answer. A bird simply sings because it has a song." And Maya Angelou said, "I know why the cage bird sings, and we know why the African American slaves sang. They sang because they had a song in their heart. It was the one thing that nobody couldn't take away from them. Not even they themselves could hold back the song." And you see, back in that day, the rule was that they weren't allowed to talk on the slave plantations while doing their difficult chores because they could be, planning something. So they weren't allowed to talk, but they were allowed to sing. They were allowed to sing. So when groping in hopelessness, they sang, "Soon I will be done with the troubles of the world." When desperate for a way out of their suffering and oppression, they sang, "Swing low, sweet chariot, coming forth to carry me home." And there were moments when they dreamed of escape from slavery, and they communicated it among themselves as they sang out, steal away, steal away home to Jesus." And when forced to work bare feet in the snow, they sang, "I've got shoes and you've got shoes, and all God's children got shoes." And when the cries of fellow slaves being beaten unmercifully by their master became too much to listen to, they sang, "Up above my head, I can hear music in the air." When nursing the wounds inflicted upon them by their slave masters, using natural medicine from bushes and trees all around the plantation, they would sing, "There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul." One wonders, what is the story behind what is believed to be one of the very first Negro spirituals we are claiming, Jacob's Ladder. I did quite a bit of reading this week to get to the bottom of it, and the research is not conclusive. One thing that is conclusive is that this song was alive and being sung as early as 1825. It's believed that it was written by the slaves in Liberia. And the biblical imagery of Jacob's ladder inspired in them the hope of someday climbing rung by rung and step by step and test by step above and out of the oppression and the suffering and the injustice under which they lived. Over the centuries, verses have been added. This has become a favorite spiritual even among white folks all across the world. And I imagine that some of the verses that we just heard were added because they wouldn't relate to where the slaves were at that time. In fact, this song became the theme song for the documentary, The Civil War. The reason I'm highlighting that today, apart from the fact that it speaks so directly to the experience Jacob has in chapter 28, I'm highlighting this because the song doesn't tell the whole story of the chapter before us. It serves meaningful purpose, the cadence and the beat and the soul that it evokes is so wonderful. And yet the story out of which it's taken is much bigger and much more involved. Let me invite you to come to Genesis chapter 28. And for a few minutes, let me just peruse the chapter. Let's just look around and see what all is there. In the first two verses, Jacob sets out on his journey with the blessing of his father Isaac. In verses 3 and 4, Isaac reiterates the Abrahamic blessing. There is no longer any question, no doubt as to what Isaac actually thinks. Remember, God had told Rebekah that the older will serve the younger, that the blessing will go through Jacob. And Isaac wasn't always cooperating with that, but now we're past that. Now he's given it all. He's placed the blessing. In fact, the blessing that he pronounces upon Jacob is almost a verbatim repeat blessing of what God had said to his father Abraham and what God has said to him. Verses 6 through 9. Esau marries a third wife, and this is a topic of much conversation. He had been married to two Canaanite girls, and after Jacob left, he goes and he marries this third wife, Mahalath, I think is the way you say that. Let me pause. Let's take a look at this. Let's not just pass this over. Verse 6 says, Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away to Padan Aram to take for himself a wife from there, and that as he blessed him, he gave him a charge, saying, you shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. And that Jacob had obeyed his father and his mother and had gone to Padan Aram. Verse 8, and Esau saw that the daughters of Canaan did not please his father Isaac. So Esau went to Ishmael and took Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebajoth, to be his wife, in addition to the wives that he had. Here's the reason why I'm sticking a pin here. I have previously thought, and perhaps I have said in my comments during the series, that Esau may have gone and married this third woman out of spite, to kind of rub it in. After what he experienced with Jacob at the hands of his mom and dad, now since he knows that marrying the Canaanite girls is troublesome to them, let me just kind of do it in. But that's not what's happening here. Esau didn't marry these women out of defiance or spite. He grew up in that family as the not too favored twin son, knowing that his younger brother had been chosen over him. You see, we live out the scripts that our family writes for us. And a lot of what Esau had been doing, he's just kind of following the script. The things of God were not important to Esau. He didn't know anything about it being wrong to marry the Canaanite girls. Perhaps his parents never told him the meaning of all of that. After all, since he didn't count, and since the blessing was going to go through Jacob, perhaps they never ever told him. He didn't know. See, he's not carrying the godly line, and so who he married didn't seem to matter, and he married the Canaanite girls. He's now just putting it all together. He didn't marry this third girl to hurt his parents for what they did to him. He went to Ishmael's line. Notice this. He didn't marry another Canaanite girl. He married one of Ishmael's daughters. That is, he's trying to get as close as he can to Abraham's descendants, to the line of Seth. He can't go down to Padan Aram. He's never been there. They've never initiated him going down there. I guess he could if he wanted to, but he's doing the best he can. Esau is trying to get into the good graces of his parents. This is not, let's see what I can do to hurt you. Rather, this is, what can I do to please you? What can I do to make you love me? How do I get your approval? I know what I'll do. I'll marry one of Abraham's granddaughters, one of my grandpa's granddaughters, one of my second cousins. I will do whatever I can to get into your good graces. I hope you can see that today. Esau is doing his best to get in with his parents now that Jacob has gone. Look at verses 10 and 11. Jacob's journey is interrupted. We get the sense that Jacob is traveling all by himself. He's not being accompanied by anybody because he's going to be gone for weeks, perhaps months. No one is going to go with him because they would have to come back because he's not coming right back. And so we get the sense that Jacob is alone. He doesn't have a caravan. He's not carrying much with him. Perhaps mom made him some bread and some sandwich and some drink. But Jacob is all alone. After traveling a far distance, he comes to the end of a long day. The sun is setting. He takes a stone for a pillow and he goes to sleep. And now his sleep is interrupted by a dream. And we have the details of the dream in verses 12 through 15. The dream is described. There's a ladder stretching from earth to heaven. And there are angels ascending. It's a broad ladder, broad enough for two people, two angels, to ascend and descend on the same rungs at the same time. The top of the ladder is God, and God is looking down upon Jacob, and God pronounces a blessing upon Jacob and tells him, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bless the world through you. He tells him what he told Isaac. He tells him what he told Abraham. The God at the top of the ladder is speaking to Jacob, and Jacob is having this tremendous experience. By the way, in Psalm 109, Psalm 103, Psalm 103, verses 19 through 23, the Lord has established his throne in heaven, and his kingdom rules over all. Blessed be the Lord. Bless the Lord, you his angels, who excel in strength, who do his word, heeding the voice of his word. Bless the Lord, all you his hosts, his angels, you ministering spirits, who minister and do his pleasure. Bless the Lord, all his works, in all the places of his dominion. Bless the Lord, O my soul. Bless the Lord, O my soul. There in Psalm 103, the angels of God are described as ministering spirits. That's what they are. In Hebrews chapter 1, the writer of Hebrews quotes Psalm 103. And he says, Hebrews 1, verse 13, but to which of the angels has he ever said, sit thou on my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool? Are they being angels, are they not all ministering spirits sent to minister to those who will inherit salvation? Can I just quickly tell you in passing the significance of Hebrews chapter 1, the verses I just read? What it's saying is each of us who come to Christ, who come to salvation, we have an angel, right? We have a guardian angel. And here in this dream, Jacob sees more than one angel. He sees a multitude of angels ascending and descending, a ladder so high that it reaches up to the heavens. Verses 16 through 17, Jacob wakes up. And here's what it says. It says, then Jacob awoke from his sleep, and he said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I didn't know it. And he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. The word awesome there, really, in the raw vernacular, Jacob is saying, how dreadful is this place? Surely the presence of the Lord is in this place, and I didn't know it. How often we are unaware of God's presence, and how often we forget that there is no place where we can be, but that God is present there with us. Psalm 139. So here's what I want to do. I want to spend the next several minutes framing this for us. This is a very, very, very important passage as we make our way through Genesis. And we're past the halfway mark now, as I'm sure you've noticed. But here in Genesis 28, there are three things you need to see. Three life lessons. Number one, there's a ladder that isn't meant to be climbed. There's a ladder that isn't meant to be climbed. You see, we live in a ladder climbing culture. We speak of climbing the corporate ladder, climbing the success ladder. We speak of the leadership ladder. We speak of the level 5 leader who climbs from level 1 to level 5. There's a wonderful book called The Ascent of a Leader, printed by Josie Bass. And I use that occasionally when I'm working with young men that I'm coaching on leadership. And that book is about how to make sure that you're not missing any of the rungs. And too many young men get to the top skipping the process and not even sure how they get up there. And these days I'm spending most of my life trying to talk guys down from the ladder. Come down, come back down. And don't even climb the ladder. Because you see, quite often the ladder is leaning against the wrong wall. Those of us who have made it to the top, we know it's lonely at the top. A lot of times the climb is not worth it. And here in this chapter, we have this ladder, Jacob's ladder, which really isn't meant to be climbed. First of all, because it's not Jacob's ladder, it's God's ladder. Notice who's standing at the top of the ladder. It's God's ladder. And the ladder that we have here, the only creatures climbing this ladder are the angels of God. And in fact, I noticed in Dr. Henry Morris's book on Genesis this week, he reminds us, he says that there is no real, literal staircase in heaven. No real staircase connecting heaven and earth with angels ascending and descending. This is only a dream that Jacob is having. But it was a dream highly symbolic of a very marvelous reality, Dr. Morris says. It's only a dream, but it's a symbol, and it's symbolic of something really, really marvelous. And that is that there is a great gulf between heaven and earth, but there is someone who lives to bridge that gulf, to bridge that divide. This ladder between heaven and earth in Genesis 28 is to remind Jacob that while he's scurrying down to pay an errand, to do his thing and to find a wife and to escape Esau and all the things that have been on his agenda his whole life, this ladder is to remind Jacob that it's not just about him and his agenda and what he's doing, that there's a connection between heaven and earth, and that there is a divine connection. We could have called this message the divine encounter, that heaven interfaces with earth, that God is interested in what is happening on the earth, and that the earth is not just spinning on its axis by itself, and that there is a God who is in charge. And Dr. Morris reminds us today that in John chapter 1, verse 51, toward the end of the chapter, when Jesus meets Philip and Philip calls Nathanael, and Jesus speaks to Nathanael and he says, before I saw you under the fig tree, I knew you. And Nathanael said, oh God, you're the Son of the living God. And Jesus said, because I said what I said, you believe in me? He says, hereafter you'll see greater things than this. And what did Jesus tell Nathanael he's going to see? In verse 51 of John chapter 1, he says, hereafter you will see heaven open, and you will see the angels of God ascending and descending. And Dr. Morris says that in this verse, Jesus Christ is actually saying, I am this ladder. I am the ladder. This ladder is Jesus. He is the ladder that connects earth to heaven. He is the ladder that transcends our human experience. He is the ladder. He is the connection. He is the staircase. He is, if you will, the one who lives to bridge that divide, to bridge that gulf between heaven and earth. For there is one God and one mediator between God and man, and it's the man Christ Jesus. I love that. Jesus is in fact this ladder. It's not to be climbed. In fact, in my browsing around in preparing this message, I noticed there's a whole business industry called ladders are for decoration. Some ladders are decorative, just to look at, not to be climbed. So as we come to Genesis 28 today, we're reminded of this marvelous reality, of this staircase, this connection that God himself makes for us in Jesus between what happens on earth and what happens in heaven. Here's the second thing that you need to see in Genesis 28. Experiencing God is a prerequisite to enjoying the blessing. You see, Jacob is now carrying the godly line that we have been observing from Genesis chapter 3. Isaac has made no compunctions. He's now fully on board with God's plan that the line will come through Jacob. But so far, Jacob's life shows no indication of any God consciousness. We never hear Jacob praying. There's nothing about his encounter with God. The motivation for Jacob's journey down to Padan Aram, what are they? Number one, to find him a wife. Number two, to escape the wrath of his brother Esau. But listen, God has a third agenda for Jacob. And what is that agenda? God's agenda for Jacob is God himself. You see, Jacob isn't going out to look for God, but God is going to show up for Jacob. God is already there waiting for Jacob. God has a way of showing up even when we're not looking for him. This God encounter in Genesis 28 is necessary because Jacob has a hole in his soul, a hole in his heart, a hole that makes him grab onto his brother's heel coming right out of the womb. He's always scheming and conniving and trying to get more and tricking people out of what belongs to them. He has a hole in his heart, a hole in his soul, which only God can fill. That's what Blaise Pascal said. There's a God-shaped vacuum in every human heart which only God himself can fill. And Jacob has a hole. And God knows that. And God is about to fill that hole with himself. St. Augustine in his prayer said, Lord, thou hast created us for thyself, and we are restless until we find our rest in you. Do you know somebody who's just like Jacob? Restless, a hole in the soul, can't ever have enough, can't ever stop, can't just more and more and more. Well, what we're learning here is that in order to enjoy the blessing, in order to enjoy the goodness and the blessings of God, the prerequisite for that is that we have to experience God first. We have to encounter God. We have to have this experience with God. Anybody that God is going to use to carry the blessing, to embody the promise, must be shaped by God and indwelt by God and experience God. And that brings us to point number 3. And that is that God's work of shaping Jacob's heart in this chapter is only the beginning. What God does in shaping Jacob's heart is only the beginning of a process that will last a lot longer. Notice what Jacob does when he awakens from this dream in chapter 28. Jacob awakens. Jacob expresses his awareness of God's presence. Surely the Lord is in this place, and he didn't even know it. Jacob responds in worship. Jacob builds an altar. Remember the altars of Genesis. Here's another altar. He builds an altar and he pours oil on it. Maybe his mom had given him a flask of oil for in case you get burned or stung by an insect or something. He takes the oil and he pours the oil on the rock that he used for a pillow and decides to offer up an oblation, offer up an offering of worship to the Lord. And notice what else he does. He marks the spot by giving it a name. What does he call the place? He calls it Bethel. Bethel. And he makes a vow. Jacob says, if God does everything he says, and if he blesses me abundantly and multiplies me and my family and all of that, he says, I will give to God a tenth, a tithe of everything that I have. Remember now, God's process of shaping Jacob's heart has only begun. His commitment here is conditional. If God, then I will. If God, then I will. It's interesting that God's commitment to Jacob, when God stood at the top of the ladder and spoke to Jacob, there were no ifs, there were no conditions. God simply said, I will bless. Just like he said, I'll bless Isaac. Just like he said, I'll bless Abraham. But see, Jacob has to learn. He's going to have to get past the if. You see, Job said, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. For the Lord giveth and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. For I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand in the latter day upon the earth. And even though worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh I will see God. Romans 8, Paul says, nothing, not death, nor life, nor angels, or demons, or rulers, or power, or anything, no if, no but, nothing will separate me from the love of God. You see, Jacob thinks that he's going to spend a few weeks or a few months in Padan Aram and collect his wife and come back home to his family in Beersheba. Jacob doesn't know that when he gets down there, he's going to meet his match in his uncle Laban. And he's going to spend some 20 years, 2 decades down in Padan Aram. And he's a pretty clever guy. But he's going to be outdone. He's going to be outdone. And God is going to use that experience to radically transform and reshape Jacob's heart. And Jacob is going to come back to this very spot where he is right now in chapter 28. In chapter 35, we're going to find Jacob right back at this very spot. And in chapter 35, in that experience, Jacob will not only see a ladder in his dream. In fact, he's not going to see a ladder in his dream. Jacob in chapter 35 is going to see God. Jacob is going to wrestle with God. In fact, Jacob is going to be known. God is going to say, you're blessed because you're the only guy who's ever wrestled with God and lived to tell about it. He's going to encounter God. And he will have no choice but to surrender because God is going to hurt him. God's going to touch him in his hip socket and hurt him. And Jacob is going to walk with a limp for the rest of his life. And the limp is always going to remind him of how God hurt him in order to change him, in order to bless him. As A.W. Tozer once said, it is doubtful that God can greatly use a man until he has greatly hurt that man. At the end of that wrestling match, in chapter 35, you know what Jacob does? He renames the spot. Here in 28, he calls it Bethel, house of God, the house of God. But in 35, verse 7, Jacob renames the place El Bethel, the God of the house of God. Because you see, through a long series of events and experiences in his life orchestrated by God, Jacob will eventually come to the end of himself. And that's God's goal for Jacob, or it was for Jacob, and that's God's goal for me, and that's God's goal for you. And like Jacob on this journey, you and I are on a journey, and God has one goal for us, and that is to bring us to the end of ourselves. It was God's goal for Isaac. It was God's goal for Abraham. It was God's goal for Noah. And it has always been God's goal. He gives you and me about 60, 70, 80 years to make a fast track through life. And God's goal is that somewhere along the line, sooner than later, you and I will come to the end of ourselves. It's interesting that in Psalm 27, David narrows his life down to one thing. You know, David says, one thing have I desired of the Lord, and that will I seek after earnestly with all my heart. And that is that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. Here Jacob names this place Bethel. He renames it El Bethel, the house of God. You see, Genesis 28 is not just about Jacob on the run. Genesis 28 is about the God who is on the run with Jacob, the God who is running ahead of Jacob, the God who is there before Jacob gets there, the God who is awesome in this place, the God who is sovereign, the God who is the God of grace. I hope you don't miss grace in this chapter. When God appears to Jacob in this dream at the top of the ladder, God could have said, okay, Jacob, listen up. You've been a bad boy. You've been scheming. You've been doing all this stuff. Let's have the talk. No, none of that. Because you see, God's grace is greater than all our failures. And there's a whole lot of grace here in chapter 28. That's why this chapter is about the God who is bringing a young man with a wayward heart to come to know him, to come to the end of himself, to give up the things he's holding on to, the things he's reaching for, and to reach for God and to find God and to enjoy God. I noticed in the movie Jacob's Ladder, which I haven't watched, but I read about it this week in my study. And I'm not even sure what it's about, but I noticed one of the lines of the main character in the movie. Here's what it says. This is very interesting. He looks at the other guy and he says, the only thing that will burn in hell, the only thing that will burn in hell is the part of you that won't let go of your life. The only thing that will burn in hell is the part of you that won't let go off of your life. There's this poem that was written by an anonymous soldier from the Civil War. Listen to these words. I asked God for strength that I might achieve. I was made weak that I might learn humbly to obey. I asked God for help that I might do great things. I was given infirmity that I might do better things. I asked God for riches that I might be happy. I was given poverty that I might be wise. I asked God for power that I might have the praise of men. I was given weakness that I might feel the need for God. I asked God for all things that I might enjoy all things, but I was given life that I might enjoy all things. I got nothing that I asked for, but everything that I hoped for. And almost despite myself, my unspoken prayers were answered, and I am among all men most richly blessed. Almost, despite myself. That's Jacob. You see, Jacob stole the blessing which God had already said was going to be his. Didn't have to steal anything, but he did. And now, almost despite himself, God is shaping Jacob's heart in preparation for the true blessing, which only God can give to Jacob, and the blessing that Jacob's heart truly longs for. And what's the point? And what's the deal? And what's the big idea in chapter 28? It's simply this. It's captured in a song that Larnell Harris sings so well. And Marjolaine could easily sing this. She sung this. I've heard her sing this many times. It's not in running, but in resting. It's not in trying, but in trusting. It's not in wondering, but in praying that we find the strength of the Lord. Will you stop striving and fighting and scheming and trying to make your way and defend yourself and just let go and let God and love God and surrender to God? At the end of your search, you will find that God in Jesus is all you need. Remember, it's not in wondering, but in praying that we find the strength of the Lord. Listen to Larnell Harris sing this song now. And during this song, I hope you will let the Spirit of God minister to you deep down on the inside as you surrender all things to Him. That's what I'm doing. I hope you will too. And then we'll come back and close in prayer. Amen.